Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If you're first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, welcome back. See what happens when you subscribe. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this episode, we talked to the one and only Michele Lee. She has such a cool career going through Twitter, going through Visa, working at Pinterest. And she has a lot of really cool lessons about how to be a more effective partner to the business. Really a lot of cool stories. So I hope you enjoy it. She's really smart, really cool, and you're going to love this one. And if you don't, watch the next one.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Well, how you doing? Welcome to the Ethics Experts.
I am good. I am delighted to be here.
Well, I'm excited to get you on. You have like a really cool career. I think you've worked at some really cool companies during some really cool times. And so I want to hear about all that stuff. But I always like to kind of start with, your childhood. So where did you grow up? What was your childhood like? Because you can always kind of see kind of ties back to who we are as a kid that, kind of led to us falling into this compliance pool that we find ourselves in.
So I grew up in Jersey. My parents were immigrants from Taiwan. My dad had come to study for graduate school right before he studied textile engineering. And that was right before the industry collapsed in the US and all the textile manufacturing ended up going offshore. And then my mom also came over too. And my dad owned a deli and my mom worked at an office at a bank in New York. And my childhood was in that deli. So I spent days, nights, weekends in that deli. I had a lot of giant Italian sub rolls. Good food, best sandwiches every single time at lunch, giant mountain, sort of deli sandwiches. And it was a really good childhood. It was busy, spent a lot of time, helping out at the deli, going to school, doing homework. When my dad wasn't sort of, working with customers in the shop, he'd be writing math problems for me to do. So typical sort of what you would expect, Asian parents, high standards, high demands, and hard work.
My dad was an immigrant also, and I grew up in we had a pizza place, and I was there. They set up the playpen in the pizza place, and then they had other businesses, and we were always so involved. What do you kind of draw from that experience, that sort of that immigrant mentality? Do you see any of that sort of still in you today?
There's certainly that piece of hard work. Yes, I see that, and sort of the energy, the nose to the grindstone, keep it going, hard work mentality. But there was also this other piece that I found so interesting, which was in this deli, my dad would play country music, which doesn't make any sense. Why on earth is someone who's, immigrating from Taiwan coming to America and loving country music? But it was because at his deli, there were a lot of firefighters, a lot of cops who hung out there. They loved country music. And so when my people would come into the shop and they talk with my dad, I would see how he could shift. He could shift from a person who was, dad telling me about the math problems to do, the person who could shift from his, friends who he hung out with on the weekend to, joking around with the cops and the firefighters who came in. There are people who came into the deli who spoke primarily Spanish. He'd, be like, hola, amigo. I could see the power of transformation and his ability to just sort of switch in every context to meet the customers where they were.
Yeah, and that's kind of that's kind of driven from like there's a certain intentionality and there's a certain like outward focus in order to like do that successfully.
Yes, it takes time and it takes practice. And as a kid, it was really interesting to see how his personality could shift in those different dynamics. It was very impactful as a kid because as a kid, you think you're just a person. You just do your thing every day. You go in the world, you be who you want to be. And it was interesting to see it. And I think for immigrants, there is certainly a different necessity.
Totally.
Need to sort of blend in when you need to blend in. And you need to sort of adopt the mannerisms and context and culture around you.
Yeah. So how do you see that lesson kind of showing up for you? And how does that muscle flex for you today,
So corporations and people come from different backgrounds and culture, just like you said at the start of the conversation. And when you go into a company, they can be incredibly different. When I worked at Visa, it was a much more of a banker environment, sort of, serious, much more New York investment bank than it was, Silicon Valley tech company. When I worked at the Department of Justice, folks were showing up in, more formal clothes. People were going to court every day. There was a different environment. And then when I got to Twitter, it was, flip-flops and jeans and, sitting around drinking coffee in the log cabin that was imported from the middle of the woods. Like in all of these environments, there was something very different. And the energy of the people is very different. And when you're a lawyer and you're trying to counsel your clients, you've got to meet people where they are. You're not going to talk to the 20-year-old engineer who graduated recently the same way that you're going to talk to, the president of the company who has been working in financial services and talks to banks every day. So I think those skills from childhood really have translated well to communicating with people in a way that they are most comfortable with.
Yeah. It's like an attunement. It's like a sort of external attunement. You can kind of tune your instrument to them in kind of a natural way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's part of, how you reach people. Often folks don't want to bring the lawyer into the room. They're like, oh, we'll just go get them when we need a contract. But to really be impactful as an attorney and as an advisor, you've got to be in the room. You've got to build trust, and being able to talk to everybody about the things that they're interested in is really critical.
So what do you do? Just play country music in your office?
I actually have loved that there's been this resurgence of country music. Beyonce's country album was fantastic.
Yeah. It's back.
Texas Hold'em was very solid. Yeah.
Yeah, it's back. All right. So you went from working in the deli, doing math problems on the side, to law school. What drove you on that path?
So, in that deli, when we had days off of school, my dad would bring in this TV, which was about, yay big and had like a black and white screen. And we would watch TV quietly on the side of the deli. And I could get Matlock. And back in the day, Matlock was this fantastic show where this guy, is a trial lawyer. He goes into court and he'd, do sort of like these amazingly kitschy things like, but you weren't wearing your glasses, so how can you be the eyewitness? And I thought it was absolutely fantastic. This guy coming in, bringing in justice, reasoning through these very complicated fact patterns, and then, in 30 to 45 minutes, winding it up and bringing it home. And the guy, would inevitably be innocent. And there was Matlock averted a grave miscarriage of justice. And so law school seemed incredibly interesting to me, especially sort of with that immigrant child, first generation mindset of you don't really know what the rules are. You often think you're going to get in trouble for something. And, when you see things like that about the law in action, you get a sense of I could get to learn the rules. I can understand what, makes up the fabric of society and how things operate. And I can help other people if they need help with figuring out these rules. And so that was what brought me to law school. I always wanted to be a part of that justice system and understanding how things work.
Did you ever get your Matlock moment?
I'm trying to think of some equivalents. I don't think I've ever had anything.
Nothing that dramatic and nothing in 45 minutes, Nothing
in 45 minutes for sure. They don't show you in the TV shows how much time is spent just like looking at documents and timelines and revising. It
wouldn't make a good show,
Yeah. It's always much slower. I've searched all weekend through every possible email that this executive sent, and thank goodness there's nothing bad. I've had as an associate, I remember when you'd find sort of the smoking gun documents, that would be pretty exciting. But it was
like, I'm really doing it. I'm doing it.
Yeah. I found it. I found the key to the case. And so there have been moments of that, but nothing quite so dramatic.
But that's, it's cool to be running at something from a young age. Like, so it sounds like you were young and you're like, I really want to be a lawyer. And so you probably had that in your mind as you're going through elementary and going through junior high and high school. And that was sort of a North Star to like drive at. Was that kind of the case?
Yeah, I did high school debate. I did high school mock trial. Then I went to college. I did some mock trial there. It always sort of was in the backdrop of something I wanted to do.
So What was surprising about law school for you?
Surprising about law school. I thought it was going to be this really hyper competitive experience where everyone was out to get each other. People sort of prepared me and said, law school is one where you're going to go in, you're going to ask for someone's outline about a class you missed, and they're going to say no and run from you. And that actually literally does happen at other law schools. But I went to a law school, I went to American in Washington, D.C., and there was a really strong focus on help saving the world. The environment, human rights. There was this sense of, we really want to make the world a better place. There are a lot of folks who had come in to do public interest work. And that really changed the whole tone of the law school. It wasn't folks competing for, a certain number of slots to be summer associates. It was much more folks really investing time and energy in thinking about how they could make an impact on sort of the global legal system. And to this day, some of my very best friends still are from that law school time period. And it was a really fantastic experience.
It's kind of interesting, the mission of that school, or the direction of that school, with the focus that it has, sort of like attracted people that are kind of the antithesis of this sort of cutthroat caricature that you hear about law school.
Yeah. It was, kind people who wanted to do great things. And law school became like a really fun experience for me. I expected that it would be tough, but I never expected how rewarding it would be with the friendships, with the amount of time that you get to spend really just sitting around and thinking. Once you leave school, you spend a lot of time doing and working and, this deadline, that Slack message. In law school, you can kind of just sit in this nice cocoon where you get to really think deeply about legal principles.
Yeah, that's maybe in another life I went to law school or something. So were you pretty singularly focused on becoming a trial attorney throughout that whole process? Or because there's like 1,000 paths out of law school, like were you kind of primarily on that, but kind of exploring some different things? I know you ended up being a trial attorney, but talk to me about that hallway you walked through.
Yeah, I always wanted to be in a courtroom. I thought that would be the most remarkable thing, to get to argue in court and get to argue positions. So that sort of guided the journey in law school as well. I did moot court. I, did trial practice classes. That was sort of it. I never thought I would sort of dive into antitrust, though. That was where I ended up going. Which is the first job I had out of law school, which was based on antitrust and understanding antitrust law and antitrust criminal law of all things. I'd never studied that in law school, but that once I started practicing in that area, I thought it was really great.
What was so interesting about that field, or that sort of that niche?
So back in the day, antitrust was a lot more about cases involving there was like waste disposal, auto car part conspiracies. And it was interesting. It was interesting learning about the principles, how economies work, how competitors should and shouldn't talk to each other, about how large companies can continue to get ahead by taking certain steps. That was always very interesting to me. But it got more interesting over the years. Once I started practicing antitrust as an associate, there are all these cases that were brought against big tech. And that's been really interesting to see the law evolve there, but also just see how folks are thinking about it, seeing folks think about how the biggest tech companies have really taken steps to further their growth and potentially even stifle competition from, smaller upstart players.
Yeah, that incentive is always kind of there,
Yeah. When you're a really big company, you just keep growing and getting bigger. And most companies, I think, try to do the right thing. But I think sometimes inadvertently, it really changes the competitive landscape.
So you made a pivot into being a trial lawyer, right? You were kind of working for the government. So talk to me about that change and what drew you there? Like, how did you know it was time to make that jump?
So I've been an associate at a really great law firm, Wilson Sonsini, and I thought to myself, I am going to be taking a very long time before I get to see the inside of a courtroom. And that's just sort of the nature of the practice. There are a lot of great lawyers at law firms, and it can take time for them to get into a courtroom. And so I spoke to a friend who was at DOJ. He was going to trial all the time. So I went over, he put my resume in a pile, which was great, forever grateful to that friend. And I got a job at the Department of Justice. It was fantastic. You go into the office day one, you think, well, how do I do this job? Who's going to teach me what to do? They just give you a pile of cases. They're like, go off, investigate, see if you want to bring a case, see what you want to do. What do you want to bring to trial? There are people who, prove and sort of serve as checks to make sure that you're on the right track. But for the most part, there was an incredible amount of autonomy for a young lawyer to just go and do really neat things. And so I had cases involving hospital chains, defense spending, just general healthcare fraud, for-profit education fraud, and really had this full remit to go and work with agents and U.S. attorneys around the country to investigate cases and figure out where things had gone wrong.
So I think I'm a little ignorant. So how does that work? So this pile of cases, where did those come from?
So they got these referrals. So there are folks who file key tam cases, they're whistleblowers, and they say, look, I think this person's defrauding the government. And so these complaints would be brought up in the name of the individual by themselves, but they would say, I would like to file this nominally on behalf of the government. Government, do you want to get involved? And so the government would take a look at the case and say, all right, let me talk to the person who's filing this. Let me talk to other potential people who might be involved and who might help with this. Let me, create a civil investigative demand for the company potentially and ask the company directly some hard questions. And then after that, you decide, do you have enough for a case after speaking with everyone? Should you file a complaint? Should you proceed with going to court? And often there is quite a bit of fraud. When folks are getting money from the government, there's quite a bit of fraud and folks cutting corners about doing the right thing just because there's so much money when, the government can be involved in government contracting.
So, I mean, it's like, you've been sitting on the pool deck and you're like, man, I'd love to swim one day. Maybe and then you go to DOJ and they're just like, yeah, sure, here you go. And they just kind of push you in the pool.
Dive on in. It was the best way to learn, though. And there's some really great lawyers who have been there forever around me. The office was small enough that folks would do the email everybody in the office thing frequently. So you could just throw up a bat signal and say, all right, I really need help. Do you know something? Or everyone was in the office then. So you just pop over and talk to someone with, 30 years of trial experience. Some of the most brilliant people I have ever met in my whole life worked at the Department of Justice. These were folks who were just top of the category. They could remember cases just, without referring to them. They just knew case law cold. They had done, hundreds of depositions, just really brilliant folks who work there.
I mean, can you imagine how many years of experience were sort of packed in that 2.5 years that you spent there, as opposed to if you kind of joined during the remote days? What do you think that differential is? It's got to be 5x difference or something.
I think joining, remote work has so many conveniences, especially for parents, for women who are trying to, balance all the things. But in-person connection is really important. It's especially when you're up and coming in a career, the ability to just get to talk to someone who's sitting next door or run into them. Those really just small water cooler moments where you get to ask people about what's going on in their lives and hear about their cases and learn from them. Those were really, I think, important early on in my career.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my first job, it was a lot of hours and it was obviously in office. And I had a friend whose son, graduated and he went into consulting in his first 2 years. It was kind of during COVID. So he was doing all of that work in an apartment in San Francisco or something like that. And I was just thinking, my gosh, to your point, so many of those little moments sprinkled throughout where, in my case, a partner would come and sit down and help me with whatever model I was working on or whatever. And those are such building block principles that I've, carried with me throughout my career that were so kind of serendipitous that it's hard to sort of recreate that for somebody, to your point, up and coming, who's not in that kind of an environment.
I think that makes sense. I mean, when you're in that phase, you don't really know what are the questions to ask. And
Exactly.
having someone just pass your office and, check in on you, you get this sense of you start getting guidance in a way that's much more useful long term.
Yeah, and it starts to give you kind of some confidence for the next sort
Yeah.
of set of problems that you don't, didn't anticipate. So how did you go through that stack? Like, were you just kind of like, what is that process like? I'm just trying to put myself in your shoes. Like, okay, first week you have this whole stack of cases, and you're like, okay, I guess I have to like figure out which one of these has legs or something.
Yeah, you have to go off and running. You start talking to local agents, local U.S. attorneys. You fly. I was on the road pretty much every other week in that job, just flying around the country, meeting with folks, talking to them, looking at the document trail, talking to the whistleblowers to understand what might be
Mhm.
happening. It was a very much boots on the ground kind of job
Very
where
cool.
you could only figure things out by digging in.
So tell me about your first like trial experience, right? Because you're an associate and you're kind of helping the people that are, doing the thing that you want to do. You go to DOJ. Now you get your chance to do it. You go through this stack of cases. You find a case that has legs, whatever, and then tell me about that experience. What was that whole thing like?
So I got to work with two other attorneys, and I remember getting to argue in court, where you're going to summary judgment. It's sort of your last opportunity to to move on, to get the case resolved in an efficient way for all involved. And and I remember standing up in court and saying, I am Michele Lee and I represent the United States Department of Justice. And I can still, in my mind's eye, remember that moment. It
Yeah.
was so incredible to think, standing here right now, a kid who grew up in Jersey, getting to really represent the government. And I remember looking around thinking, how do I even get to do this? Like,
Right.
how am I allowed to represent the United States of America? I mean, what a huge privilege and honor. And it was magical, like to be a part of, an organization that's so committed to doing justice is it was really cool.
Yeah. I mean, you got to actually utter that sentence and it was true.
It was neat.
In a courtroom, no less. That's amazing. So when did you know that it was time to, move on to something else?
So I loved my experience there. But every February, I would notice that it would be freezing cold. And
Sometimes that's enough.
and I thought I love DC. I'd been there for over 10 years. And as a kid, I had visited LA because my mom's side of the family all moved to LA and we moved to Jersey. And I remember as a kid thinking, to live in a place with palm trees would be really wonderful. And so I moved out west to work at Visa, where there are in fact palm trees, but it is not actually that warm here. San Francisco, sort of. But it's wonderful. West Coast living is fantastic. I still remember the moment I moved out here. I was sitting having coffee outside, and I see this one car hit another car just in front of me, not like a huge, accident, just kind of tapped the car in front. And then the guy whose car got hit, gets out of his car, and he's this huge guy, like 6 foot something, like big guy. And the guy who hit him was like this older, sort of like grandpa guy who comes out of the car and they're talking to each other. And I'm thinking, oh man, I hope this goes okay. Next thing you know, I see these two folks hugging it out, talking to each other. And to me, that moment was just so uniquely San Francisco.
Like I found my home.
Yeah, it was, West Coast living is like that. People go out of their way to really be kind to each other. And it was really nice to see that.
Yeah, it's very different than the East Coast, like how that might have gone down in the East Coast. It's like a different country. So what set you on the sort of general counsel path? Like, what was it about being in-house that was so different? And I mean, you stayed there pretty much, or you stayed there and on that kind of side of the fence for a while. What was it about it that was interesting or that kind of kept you there or that kind of shifted your focus from that sort of trial goal to, the general counsel or the counsel type goal?
So it's really about sort of scope of impact and the ability to work very much as a team. So the thing that I've found that I really enjoy is working with groups of folks to achieve some sort of end goal, to tackle a project, handle a problem. And in-house, there's sort of these, they're different departments of a company, different parts of an organization, but getting to work with folks across teams who have totally different areas of expertise, totally different interests to solve a problem is really fun and really exciting. And so this, when I was at Visa, I went in to work on litigation, and Visa has massive litigation. It's not sort of, your case that takes a few months and goes away. It tends to be larger scale litigation, massive class action. And for those matters, it wasn't just the legal team working on it. It was also, you collaborate with other folks in different departments and strategy and comms to really make sure that you were doing the right thing for the company and portraying the company in the best way. And there's this element of practicality to it, which is you can't just think about what's the best legal strategy. You also have to understand, how will this impact the reputation of the company? How might, some tech reporter perceive what you're working on? Will they view your no comment as something, as a window of opportunity, as a window of opportunity to say something that you didn't mean? So there are a lot of elements and dimensions to it, and I've always really enjoyed that piece of it, thinking through those different aspects of a legal problem.
Yeah, I think that word you said is probably right. It adds like a bunch of dimensionality to a problem and just a lot of complexity.
Yeah, a lot of complexity. Nothing is straightforward. Particularly when I was at Twitter, I would always see, every day was sort of this chaotic whirlwind of problems, and getting to be a lawyer in that environment is really fun. You get to talk with all different folks around the company to try to solve problems. And, I still remember at one point, Laura Loomer had chained herself to the front door of the New York office of Twitter. And everyone
not metaphorically, we're talking actual change.
No, literally.
Yeah.
There was this call of, what do we do? How does one respond to a circumstance where someone handcuffs themselves to the front door? And brilliantly, the comms team just brought her a blanket and I think a hot cocoa. So
kind of checkmated her with that.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that was an incredible solution.
Totally.
It's interesting. Like there are different ways to solve a problem, and legal often isn't the only way. There are so many other things that you can do and approach a problem, and Twitter taught me that in spades.
So aside from the log cabin, what else was like super different? You said flip-flops, you said coffees, you said log cabin, versus that sort of investment banking type kind of vibe, maybe at the more buttoned up Visa. What was it about that change that was so different, and what do you feel like you learned there that really added some significant tools to your toolbox?
It was a totally different environment. When I was at the government, you would have to contribute money to a group pot to get water, to be in the water club. They'd call it water club. You'd pay into a pot to get water for the water club. When I went to Twitter, you step in and there are like 20 different versions of water, from flavored to freshly made to citrus spiked,
Yeah.
It was wild times in tech in 2015, I believe. During my interview, someone came and brought me freshly fried miniature donuts and then proceeded to ask me questions. And I remember thinking to myself, my goodness, how is this possible? It's like I'm in an amusement park. It's
right.
Obviously it was a little bit sold after that moment. It was it was a really great time. Unlike other places where you sort of have to put on the trappings of formality, dress a certain way or take on a certain cadence of speech, Twitter was whatever you want to be, come as you are, with your flip-flops, with your hoodie, with, you can work early in the day, you can work early at night. It was sort of the ultimate flexibility, and also just sort of the ultimate, you are who you are, and just bring yourself to work and come work on cool things. There was never a sense at Twitter that folks needed to do anything. It wasn't like there was never a person, a boss who sat there and said, well, you must do X and you must do Y. It was much more a community of folks who showed up every day and thought, I really like it here. And I really like the folks I work with. And I want to do great things because I want to help everyone else out. And that seemed like such a great incubator for creativity,
totally,
for progress. Yeah, it was a really magical place to work. And at the time, when I moved there, I remember at Vista, folks were asking me, they said, how does Twitter actually make any money? Are you sure you want to do this with your life? And it turned out to be just one of the best things I've done in my career because it was so fun and so interesting and innovative. There was so much going on all the time there.
How do you think they got that right? You know what I'm saying? Like this thing of like, I'm going to kind of paint a broad sort of caricature of it, but like no boss, just kind of do whatever. And yet they build this phenomenal company. Like, how did that, like, because there's some mechanism, right? Like there's some kind of forcing function that causes, I mean, obviously people want their paycheck. So there's some kind of voluntary, marginal effort expenditure. Like how did those sort of marginal expenditures get placed on the right things sort of in aggregate to such an extent that the company was able to grow and be what it is today,
Yeah. It's
we'll get to it. Okay. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm just saying, call it chapter one. You know
chapter
what I mean?
One. And chapter one certainly was not perfect, right? There were a lot of struggles. The company was constantly under pressure to grow its audience, grow its revenue. The company itself had, a number of challenges, even in those sort of earlier days. But culturally, they always got it right because they trusted folks to be grown-ups. And that's an incredible thing. If you say to a team, I want you to do X, Y, Z, and the team comes back and says, I do X, Y, Z, your growth is only as far as that leader's imagination and that leader's ability to set markers for what progress is.
Right.
In Twitter's environment, you had some of that, you had some direction, but it was much more, what do you think X, Y, Z should be? And folks came in with really incredible ideas. Right. And especially for hyper competitive spaces like this, where things are changing all the time and things are growing and there are competitors springing up, having that element of flexibility and creativity really, I think, allows a company to just go a little bit farther than anyone would have imagined at the onset. Because, great people who are excited about something bring better ideas than people who are just operating based on what they're told to do.
Yeah, it's kind of paradoxical in a way, right? It's like if you can hold on to something looser, it'll grow better or something. It's a very interesting thing to, it's one thing to sort of talk about it over coffee, and it's another thing to, how many people were at Twitter? Like several thousand people.
Yeah.
And so you have this massive organization that has this massive reach. It grew a ton, I think. It's hard for me to think back to that era because, that was before Instagram really took off, right? Or was Instagram just starting to kind of take off around that
time? It was around the time when Instagram was taking off. And it certainly feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it?
But we had a whole COVID chapter in between, yeah.
There were anchoring principles. When I first interviewed at Twitter to take the job, they had this lawsuit against the Department of Justice. And I asked our then general counsel and said, did it take a long time to decide to sue the government? And she goes, no, we all looked around. We thought it was the right thing to do. And the lawsuit was involving the government would secretly ask for information about users. They'd come in and they'd say, this is a security thing. We can't tell you why we're asking information about this particular user, but we want you to tell us about it. And for Twitter there was this underlying mantra of we've got to do right by our users. You shouldn't be sharing information with them for the government. Right. Generally speaking, we trust the United States government, but there are lots of governments around the world. And there are some governments that, do really scary, terrible things when you give information about your users to them. And Twitter had its head on right about, what's our moral compass? How do we make these tough decisions and calls about things? And the company was unified in understanding we do what we think our users would want us to do. We want to build user trust. And sometimes that could be in tension with what the law required. But the company had these unifying principles which even though there was sort of this environment of, do what you want to do and think about ways to better the company on your own and that flexibility, there were some, things that anchored the company as a whole.
So was that surprising that, hey, yeah, we just looked around the room. It seemed like the right thing to do. So we did it. Was that surprising?
It was
like,
totally surprising to me. Yeah. I mean, most companies would first not sue the government. And two, if you did, it would be sort of an arduous, difficult decision involving a lot of process. But I remember on day one, right when I started at Twitter, and you've got new hire orientation, there were people talking about how amazing the legal team was. It was really well known that the legal team would go to court and defend the rights of users and stand up for anonymous speech. And,
interesting.
So more than any other company I've been at, the people at Twitter understood what legal was doing to help further the goals of the company and really respected that.
That's a big deal, right? I mean, that's not super common that you're hearing about. I mean, I know that you came in a legal position, but just it sounds like that was like sort of a general orientation, and you heard this sort of chorus from, maybe perhaps non-legal people who are kind of singing the praises of this department that in many organizations does not get that kind of, strategic endorsement or respect.
That's right. Legal typically is they might be a partner. Sometimes they're well regarded, but they're usually not held on a pedestal in the same way.
Yeah.
And it was neat to see that.
So how did you feel that once you're out of orientation and you're just doing sort of the day-to-day, which I'm sure there was so much crazy variety during that time and in that role, how did that sort of pedestal that legal was on, how did you benefit from that in doing your regular work?
It was person by person, but for the most part, folks were really collaborative with legal. They respected the advice of legal. So there are always disagreements, and I think that's the way it should be. There's got to be healthy disagreement about, what should happen. But there was never a doubting that legal was being too, was overstepping or had bad intentions or wasn't thinking about the company first or the users first. It sort of translated into just like an easier working relationship.
Do you feel like, so I'm just trying to contrast and this might sound stupid, in which case you can just exit the meeting, I guess. But Visa, it's kind of Visa and MasterCard. I know that there's other cards, but they're kind of the main players, and there's not this, again, this could be wrong, but there's not this uncharted territory, I would imagine, within the organization where we're who knows where we'll go. But you stepped into an organization in Twitter where the team that you're on is very sort of, everyone knows it, right? Everyone is wearing a jersey, and you have other competition out there that's kind of well known, but there seems like there was this massive gap of well, where could this thing go? That's kind of, in an organization that's really driving on innovation and creativity, in kind of, building something new, who knows where it's going to go? Do you feel like some of those sort of macro competitive dynamics allowed for a more sort of insular culture where it was very clear that everybody was on the same team and we're all kind of pushing forward? Was that a dynamic that fed into this thing? Or was it really just unique to the culture that was built there?
I think it really was unique to the culture and the environment. Okay. It was all of those things that you said, which was, Visa has a business model. There are some, ancillary things that come up, but there's a core business model. When I was at Twitter, you had Twitter, you had Vine, you had an ad exchange they later acquired. They had a developer software kit. There were other sort of side things, and later there was Blue Sky, which was the different type of social network. There were all these ideas floating around and things that people pursued that were separate from core Twitter, which I think was interesting. But there was just sort of a sense of, we're in it together because maybe because it was uncharted, but honestly, because everyone just liked each other. It was sort of this, and I think the company really did a great job with investing in its employees. it was clear that the employee base was important. It was, they took time to bring employees together. They held company events. There were unifying things across the company that were thematically similar. And there are stories of employees who were shared. I mean, remember in the office, there was this neon sign that said, "Love where you work." That was occurred at other places in different offices as well. There were some things that people just had as like a common shared language and experience that
cool. Yeah.
that pulled the company together.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just like it adds such a lubricant to the engine, where you're not overheating. So you were head of global litigation. So how many like cases were you over at a time? Like, I just have no idea of the scope. Is it like 10? Is it 50?
It is more than that, but it's also very regional. So in Brazil, there can be hundreds of cases because there are low dollar value cases, either based on content removal or any number of things. In Japan, there were, I think, dozens. By the time I left, the docket continued to grow.
It's crazy, right? I mean, it's hard to fathom for me how big that whole thing is. So I want to talk a little bit about Pinterest, where there you were general counsel. What was it about that role that was really attractive to you? Was it kind of exposure that you got on the Twitter side? What kind of drew you to that role, and what kind of principles did you bring with you from these previous experiences at DOJ and at Twitter and at Visa as you sort of crafted, an entire sort of system that you were kind of responsible for to like a different degree?
Yeah. So when I left Twitter, I'd been working on litigation and regulatory matters. And then this opportunity at Pinterest involved getting to take on a new team, getting to work with the employment legal team and a great leader over there. And I remember going through the interview process, and there was the general counsel at Pinterest. Her name was Christine Flores. Her name still is Christine Flores. And she had this incredible reputation. Everybody I knew who had worked with her said she is just, she's the real deal, great person, super sharp. You'll really like her. And in fact, she is fantastic. And, I'm still friends with her today and consider her just such a mentor and supporter of my career. But she just seemed like a great person to work with. So I thought, all right, I'm going to switch sides of the internet. And it's not like there are sides on the internet, but Twitter's audience was, I think, 70, 60, like very high percentage male demographic. And then Pinterest is the exact opposite.
Interesting.
It is very heavily female. And, the philosophies of the platforms are completely different. On Twitter, it was, let's try to keep speech up. We want our users' voices to be heard. Let's try and keep speech up. If some court in Germany tells us to take speech down, we're going to really try to fight hard to keep that speech up. Pinterest is much more of a curated environment in the sense of they want it to be the happiest corner of the internet. They want it to be a place where you see great images. It's not about controversial speech, nothing political, really. And
not a lot of debates going on there,
No debates happening. People are just sitting, looking at happy images and feeling inspired about their latest craft or hobby or, home renovation. So it's a completely different environment to step into. But oddly enough, a lot of the same legal issues. So there were issues, even in a place like Pinterest, there is, problematic spam, there are safety issues, there are copyright discussions, there are all sorts of issues that come up just in the online platform space that are consistent. And I got to take on this sort of new challenge of working with a great person over there who leads the employment team now, Amira, about, employment issues. And so that was also really interesting. When I stepped into Pinterest, there was an investigation that was happening at the board level about, this, what feels like a different era and time now. There was allegations of racial and gender discrimination against Pinterest, and that had caused the company really to have, internal employee turmoil about how it had been handled, and what the company was going to do next. And so I entered the company right around that time of it had started to sort of settle down, but there were ensuing lawsuits and disputes about, what had happened.
So from a legal standpoint, kind of aside, what did you learn about just from a cultural standpoint, what did you learn about how the company handled that, right? There was an issue at the board. There's a bunch of people who are like, wait, this doesn't feel right. That's a massive sort of cultural fire that could have kind of taken over the company in some bad ways.
Yeah, it was certainly a fire. So by the time I had gotten there had been I joined the company during COVID, which, COVID, difficult time to onboard. You don't get
right.
casual conversations.
Right.
I had to be very intentional in sort of figuring out what everyone did and who everyone was, and just literally set up time with every last person in the legal team and everyone I could find just over Zoom to figure things out. But they had a company walkout on Slack. And how do you have a walkout?
Oh my gosh.
Right. Like, how do you have a walkout in virtual times? And so, that's exactly right. Literally Slacked a message saying I'm walking out. And so there had been a company walkout. There had been a lot of company unrest, and people were really unhappy with how things had been handled. There was a chief operating officer who had said that she faced gender discrimination. And so she left. And then in the wake of that, there were two women who said that they had been victims of racial discrimination. And, for the company, it was really difficult because there wasn't much to substantiate. There wasn't anything to substantiate the allegations, but it was also a really specific moment in time. And I think employees were just really unhappy with hearing that nothing wrong had happened. And so there was a lot of discussion there about how best to handle that. And it was difficult. So that was right around the time when I joined, when, there were subsequent follow-on lawsuits, and, the board was interested in knowing what was happening and what was going on. And there was this sense of, how can we repair and rebuild the company? And like any crisis, generally, you can always repair and rebuild a company. It just takes a lot of time. You have to be open, direct, transparent with the employee base, and also walk them through the changes that you're making.
It's such a difficult, it's such a difficult kind of gray zone to be in, because it may or may not have happened, but you can't really substantiate it. So then what is the company supposed to do? I mean, it's almost like, the two sides are watching very different movies, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So if the whole employee base feels like something is going on, whether it's substantiated or not, it's going on, how do you attack that?
Yeah. And that's difficult. And I think that's sort of the playbook for how it works out in other types of crises too, right? A company will say, companies entering corporate crisis, all of a sudden public opinion turns against them. And the company, their first response is to say, I didn't do anything wrong. I mean, of course I was right. But once you've already gotten sort of that tide of public opinion against you, you've got to think about the steps that you're going to take to really address folks at the core argument, not the defensive piece of we didn't do anything wrong. It's got to be, here are the proactive things that we're doing to rebuild trust with you as our employee, as our user, as our audience. And it can be difficult to move folks even within a company to get to that point, because I think a lot of folks just want to say, absolutely not. We did not do anything wrong.
So you stepped into this new sort of company, different culture, different focus, different side of the internet, as you said, and you have a different title, which probably entailed a bunch of new sort of scope, like a bunch of new things were probably in your scope of responsibility. Were there any things, any of those new things that you found really interesting, or that you really felt, man, I'm great at this, or I'm really engaged with this?
I think I started working with the employment team. So that was a team that I led in my org, and it was hard. Being an employment lawyer is a very challenging place to be, because, similar to what we talked about with, corporate crises, often with employees, it's someone who they feel like they're doing a great job. Then something goes sideways, and there are any number of reasons why it can go sideways. It might be lack of communication with a manager. It might be misperception about what work is happening. But it's tough because, people invest so much of themselves in their job and their work and trying to do a good job, that inherently these are just such heavy, loaded, weighty conversations. But I definitely, I respected employment lawyers before, but during that time and today, I mean, I respect how difficult it is, and how important it is to have someone who has just really high degrees of emotional intelligence to grapple with these complex issues.
Yeah, you think the emotional intelligence quotient necessary to be a good employment lawyer is maybe higher than other types of lawyer?
Definitely, definitely, because you're just your whole job all day is talking to people, working
Right.
with the people team, and grappling with hard stuff in a way that's very different from other areas of the law.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we're over time. I'm so sorry. I could keep
Oh gosh.
talking to you. I have one more quick question for you. So, what advice would you give if you can go back in time? This advice does not mess up your current timeline. Okay. So, what piece of advice would you give a young Michele as she's starting out that you wish you had?
Let's see. Don't take the losses so hard. I think throughout my career, there have been many times when I've, failed to do X or didn't get a job or didn't get a promotion. And, those are really tough times when you sit and you think, what else could I have done?
Yeah. Right.
And so often it's, circumstance. It's not just you. I mean, it's obviously there are always ways that we can improve and be better. But just not being so hard and beating myself up about things that didn't work out.
That's great advice. I will have I still call it Twitter. So how do you like that?
I do too. It's kind of hard,
Yeah, you can't let that go.
Yeah.
Well, Michele, this was really great. I appreciate you coming on. Yeah, this was really a fun conversation.
It was great talking to you. Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
All right. Take care.
Bye.